Hello. Welcome. Welcome to all of you. We are so glad that you're here. So thank you for being here. Gus and I are history storytellers, and as we've been researching Amsterdam's history and finding out more about Amsterdam's history, we both got a little bit obsessed with Benno Premsela. Are you okay?
You use the microphone.
You're having trouble hearing?
Can you use the microphone?
Well, it's being already picked up on the speakers. Are you not hearing it on the speakers? Can I talk louder? If I talk louder? Ah, there we go. I was afraid of talking too loud for you guys, so thank you for saying something. Are you doing, can you hear it now?
Yeah.
Excellent, okay. So, Gus and I are history storytellers, and as we were learning more and more about Amsterdam, we started to get really, really obsessed with Benno Premsela. We do tours for Badass Tours, and we've managed to work him into just about every tour that we do.
Except for the women's tour.
Except for the women's tour. Well, also like the Black History Tour, like there's a couple where he doesn't fit, but anytime we can, we're talking about Benno Premsela.
But of course, as we are kind of like learning about Benno Premsela, doing our research, we also learned a lot about his family, and we kind of fell in love with the family as well. There's a lot to admire in all of them. But what we also found is that when you actually put the stories together of the different family members, you get a much fuller image of Amsterdam around World War II, both before, during, and after.
So we're going to go back. We're going back to December of 1811. 1811. I told you, we're going back. We're going far back. The Netherlands is still under Bonaparte rule.
Yeah.
And a man from what is now Ukraine goes to Amsterdam City Hall and he registers as an Amsterdammer. Now he's from the town of Premsel, so he takes the name Premsela.
And this might have been the first time ever that he had a family name, because in many parts of Europe and throughout history, it wasn't allowed for Jewish people to pass on a family name to their families. What they did instead is a little bit confusing. What happened often was that the father would pass on his middle name to his firstborn son as his firstborn son's first name, and his first name as his firstborn son's middle name. Okay, you can already tell it gets a little bit confusing, and when the Premselas moved to Amsterdam, they continued this tradition.
So you can imagine what this has been like for us, following the Meyer Jacob and the Jacob Meyer and the Meyer Jacob and the Jacob Meyer all through the records, but we think we got it straight.
Yeah, and there's a lot of amazing family members to see throughout the history.
There was this doctor who went to the poor hospital every single day for 20 years because he was the only one who was taking care of disabled Amsterdammers, or at this poor hospital. There was a jeweler who became the jeweler to the royal court. There was a writer who moved to Jerusalem in the 1930s and wrote these beautiful, essay doesn't seem like a strong enough word, but wrote these beautiful stories, both about life in Jerusalem and about Jewish life in Amsterdam.
So you can tell we have a lot of stories. We could probably fill the whole afternoon and evening and the next day as well, but we're going to limit it to around World War II. The people we're going to tell you guys about today is a dedicated goldsmith, a doctor who was way ahead of his time, a rebellious art student, and finally a queer icon.
We're going to start with the goldsmith. Now, she was a distant cousin of the others, but we wanted to talk about her because her story includes something that we as Amsterdammers don't talk about enough. But I'm going to start with her growing up. She grew up in what was called a palace of silver. Remember that, the one I told you about who became the jeweler to the royal court? Well, his store had continued down the generations. And Jenny's father, Meyer, was the foremost antique silver expert in the country. And he had this beautiful store on the Kloveniersbrug wall. So you've probably seen it. It's right opposite the bus house. And she described it as these 5 huge windows. So all this light would come in and sparkle off the silver. gold. And Jenny herself became a goldsmith, learning under her father. And in 1940, all of that changed, almost overnight. The Nazis, when they invaded, put in a lot of rules, slowly, bit by bit, to isolate Jewish Amsterdammers. And one thing that I didn't realize until I did this research is these rules weren't in the regular papers. So if you weren't Jewish, this wasn't in the newspaper that you usually read. This probably wasn't on your radio. These rules were only published in Jewish newspapers, and you could be very severely punished for not knowing the rules. One of those rules involved Jewish businesses could now only serve Jewish customers. And at this moment, they realize they have a decision to make. You see, it's an international business, right? They're getting antiques from all over the world. There was a watchmaker named Jean Louis in Switzerland who they visited many times. And he said to Jenny, if something happens to you, come see me in Switzerland. We're going to be safe here in Switzerland. So Jenny was arguing, we should go. We should go to Jean Louis in Switzerland. And Meyer and his wife Sincha, they were afraid of what they could do. How do we get there? How do we support ourselves? How do we learn to live in a different language? They also looked at the weapons that countries had developed since World War I. And they said, there's no way this will be a long war. The weapons that countries have now are too strong. And as they're having this fight, a new rule got put into place. That any unmarried Jewish men were going to be sent to work camps across the Netherlands to do work for the German war machine. And that prompted Jenny to marry her beau, Moses. Now, everything I'm telling you is coming from either Moses' writing or Jenny's writing. And Jenny refers to him as Max. We're going to talk about another Max later, so I'm going to do my best to refer to him as Moses, but if you guys catch me saying Max, I'm just going to apologize in advance. I'm going to try to say Moses. So they get married, and they sit down again with the family, and they say, we have to go. We're going to go to Switzerland. And Jenny's younger sister decided to stay. She had to say goodbye to her younger sister, Dora. Dora gave her a purse. And that was all that Jenny was able to take with her. She had to say goodbye to Meyer, her father, and Sincha, her mother. She had to say goodbye. She had to leave her grandmother, Jenny, who she described as the sun of my life. But she wasn't allowed to say goodbye to her because her parents were afraid that the emotion might kill her 80-year-old grandmother. So she had to leave Grandma Jenny without even saying goodbye. And like all stories from this time period, there's this huge element of luck. They knew one person who supposedly could smuggle you into Belgium. And that person did get Moses and Jenny into Belgium. But the person, so they were called passeurs, the people who would smuggle people. The passeur that he connected them with in Belgium, Jenny immediately got a bad feeling. And at first, this passeur was like, oh, no, I can't get you to Switzerland. That's too hard. I can get you to unoccupied France. And so Moses and the couple they were traveling with, Bram and Alicia, Moses and Bram left Alicia and Jenny where they were staying, and they went to go see if they could find someone else. And when they were gone, this passeur that Jenny had that bad feeling about came back and he said, well, I can get you to Switzerland, but you need to give me all of your money right now. Thinking quick, Jenny said, oh, I'm so sorry, my husband has the money, he'll be back. And so the passeur goes, all right, I'm coming back at 2, have all of your money then. As soon as Bram and Moses got back, they ran from that house and they found another passeur. And thank God they did, because that house got raided that afternoon. That whole street was raided. But this other passeur was able to get them into occupied France, but not without a very tense moment. There was a train where they had to switch from one train to the other. And so they had to wait in this cafe. And they had already noticed in their short time that they could tell who the other refugees were. They would carry just a purse or a briefcase, They would wear kind of like thick clothes and raincoats, and they all always had papers so that they could cover their face if they needed to with a newspaper. And so they thought, well, if we can recognize who the other refugees are, if we can recognize the sign of another refugee, other people probably can too. So, they're at this stop, waiting for the train to pass. And they stop at the only cafe. This is like a little crossroads of the trains, right? So they stop at this cafe, and in comes a battalion of Wehrmacht officers. It's just Bram and Alicia, Jenny and Moses, and these two other Rotterdammers who are part of this group. And so the four, Jenny and Moses and Bram and Alicia, they all kind of, turn away, try to huddle away. The Rotterdammers take the complete opposite track. They start joking around with the Wehrmacht. They start saying these really tough, brutal things to the Wehrmacht. But it works. The Wehrmacht officers don't suspect them, and they're able to get on the next train. I know. So we get to the border of Switzerland, and the Passeur says, I'm not going with you. Here's where you have a choice to make. If you go this way, there's a series of farms. In that direction, you'll see a farm with a disabled person sitting at the window. That person will tell you how to get to the next farm. And then that person will tell you how to get to the farm after that. That's one way that you can take. Over there, there's an open field. But if you run across that field and go up the hill, you'll be in Switzerland. Now, the Germans patrol it, but it's raining really hard today. And so the dogs probably won't be able to smell you. And the Germans don't look back. So if you let the guard go, about 20 minutes, and then run. And so they all look at each other. Which road do we take? They decided not to, Jenny and Moses and Bram and Alicia decided not to risk the farm road. That seemed much more dangerous to them. And so they're going towards the field. And it happened, just like the Passeur said. The dog was like clinging to the officer because it was so rainy. The dog didn't notice them at all. The officer passed, he didn't look back. They ran. They were going up this really steep, muddy hill, so much so that they were having to pull on tree branches just to get to the top of the hill. But they got to the top of the hill and they made it into Switzerland. They found out later that the farm road had already been discovered. The Rotterdammers were arrested and later killed. Once they got into Switzerland, they actually found a farmer who could tell exactly what was happening. And he was like, listen, you want to avoid customs, come here, I'm going to feed you. You should stay with us. And instead they thought, well, Jean-Louis told us to come visit him, so we're probably safer with him. And they wished desperately that they had stayed with that farmer. Because Jean-Louis was nothing like the person they remembered. Jean-Louis looked at them and he said, well, occupied countries need to follow the law now. If you follow the law, you're not in any danger. I don't know why you're here. I have to follow the law. I have to report you to the police. So he did. Luckily, it seemed like the police hated Jean-Louis. They made him pay for new shoes for Jenny because her shoes were destroyed climbing up that hill. They made him give them money and food for the cell. And it was difficult, but because they had Dutch citizenship, they were able to go to the Dutch consulate and get permission to stay in Switzerland. So they were able to send letters back to their family in Amsterdam. And then in March of 1943, those letters stopped. They prayed that it was because the family had gone into hiding. But they later found out that in March of 1943, Meyer, Sinsha, Dora, and Jenny had been killed.
Let's take a moment just to remember the killed family, Jenny.
Jenny and Moses then took it as their mission to help everyone they could. They started collecting these food packages that they would send first to occupied Amsterdam and then later to the concentration camps themselves. They knew that most of these packages were stolen, that most of these packages that they worked so hard to be able to send never made it to the people who needed it. But they heard later that some of those food packages did get through. And for the people in the concentration camps, what mattered more, even more than the food, was knowing that they weren't forgotten, that there were still people thinking about them, that there were still people working for them. In one of his many, many letters to the Dutch government in exile and to the Red Cross, Moses quoted the Talmud, and he said, "He who saves one life saves the world." And he worked so hard to get the Red Cross and the Dutch government, especially in 1944, when it was clear that the tide had turned, he worked so hard to try and get something put in place for survivors. When the war ended and they came back to the Netherlands, they found their store stripped to the bare walls. In the 2 years between the invasion and when they fled, they had slowly hidden all of these pieces of silver and gold away. They knew that the Nazis were checking their books, so they used to kind of like fold these sales into other sales, or they'd write things off. But they did it to try and save some of their goods. And there was a few dozen people who had saved, who they'd given little goods to. When they got back to the Netherlands, there were 2 people who had saved their goods. There was a goldsmith in Haarlem, and there was a man who had hidden a lot of their materials in what is now the Hendrik de Keyser Foundation. But everyone else who had their gold and their silver said, "Oh, it's gone." Blech. They also found someone was living in their store. And this is the part that really surprised me, even after I'd done all of this research and I've learned so much about Amsterdam history. A lot of Jewish property was occupied after the war, and the plan that the government had for restoring things to where they were in 1940 was negotiation. So Jenny and Moses had to sit down with the person that was illegally occupying their store and try to negotiate something to get them to leave. Now you can imagine, we have a saying in English, possession is 9/10 of the law. You can imagine how hard it was for people to get someone already occupying your building to go. And Jenny and Moses, this is what makes their story so different. Jenny and Moses had not survived a concentration camp. They had survived the war in relative physical health. They had money. They had goods. They had every advantage. And even with all that, it took years to get their store back. They had to negotiate, and then when the negotiations didn't work, they had to go to court and hire an expensive lawyer, and it was a long, long process just to get their own property back. When they finally got the Palace of Silver back, and they were able to put in just the goods that they were able to save from those 2 places, they discovered they were alone. What used to be a whole street of antiques along the Hoogstraat, it was gone. They would have customers come in and saying, "Oh, you're still here?" So after all that fight, they actually had to move to a different store. It's still there, Premsela and Hamburger. You can see it on the road in. And in addition to Jenny being able to pass this store on to her son, Moses wrote a report that is, I think, important reading and should be on the curriculum now, of the way the government failed Jewish people after the war. He also wrote a history that I've borrowed liberally from to do this story.
So for the next stories, we're going to jump back to the 1930s again. While Jenny was learning her trade from her father across town, her cousin Ellie was learning to become a sculptor and a beautician.
Now, if that sounds like an odd combination or a unique combination of a sculptor and beautician, she came from an incredible family. See, Bernard was born at the end of the 19th century when Amsterdam was changing. I don't know if you guys have read about this, but the 19th century was this real period of stagnation in Amsterdam. There weren't new buildings being built, poverty was going up, there wasn't a lot of economic movement. And then at the end of the 19th century, a bunch of Amsterdammers just said, oh no, we're not doing this anymore. And so he was born into this Amsterdam that had all of these economic movements, these artistic movements, this intellectual movement. And Bernard took that and just ran with it. He started a practice. Originally, he went to Assendelft, which is where Ellie and his eldest son Robert were born, and then moved back to Amsterdam, where his son Benno was born. And he was really determined to raise his children in this kind of cultural, humanistic environment. So there's two stories from their childhood that I really like. One of them is they had all these nieces and nephews. And instead of just getting a subscription to the Concertgebouw for their 3 children, they got a subscription for their nieces and nephews as well, because they said the whole family gets to experience music and gets to experience this culture. The other story that I really like is when Benno and his siblings were teenagers, they snuck into this very controversial jazz cafe. This was on Torbekkenplein. And this cafe was so controversial that the Amsterdam mayor and chief of police actually worked together to shut the jazz cafe down. But when Bernard and his wife Rosalie found out where their children had been, they were like, yeah, we want to see this. So they went to the jazz cafe with them.
So a lot of the information that we use for these stories we got from an interview with Benno Premsela that we found across the street here at the Hollandse Schouwburg, which today is called the Kenniscentrum or the Knowledge Center, which is a resource dedicated to the Netherlands and the Holocaust. And in that interview, we got a little bit of an impression of how Benno, at least, but I think the Premsela children generally felt about their parents' parenting technique. He says, and I'm going to do it in Dutch first, and then I'll translate for the non-Dutchies here. He said, ik heb niks om af te rekenen met mijn jeugd. Dat is toch echt een cadeau als je dat van je ouders krijgt. In English, it's, I have no scores to settle with my childhood, and that's a gift if you can get that from your parents. Now, growing up in this sort of humanistic, under this humanistic philosophy, being included in the discussions around the dinner table, being encouraged to take responsibility for their own lives, and and just being sort of drowning in all of this culture around them, it's maybe natural that the Premsela children gravitated towards the arts, and Ellie kind of led the way in this. Ellie decided to go study at this new art school in Amsterdam called the Nieuwe Kunstschool. Not a very creative name, it means the new art school because it was a new art school. But here she went to study sculpting, and maybe because he looked up to her, he wanted to follow in his older sister's footsteps, Benno also later went to study there himself. He went to study interior design. And this school was founded by members of the Bauhaus movement who had fled the rise of the Nazis in Germany, and the Premsela children felt right at home there because, again, there was this humanistic philosophy. They were encouraged to take responsibility for their own lives, and Benno says, you know, at the same time it was also maybe a little bit crappy, like it was a bit poor, it was just starting up, but still they really fit in there really well. And in the time there, Ellie learned how to become a respectable sculptor in her own rights.
There was one other important thing that happened around this time, which is Benno befriended a woman named Bep. Now, she is described as vivacious and bright and outgoing, and just all these very light and full of light words are used to describe her. And Benno's brother Robert was always described as book crazy. as this kind of quieter man who was always reading, always had a book in front of him. And I might be projecting here as a loud woman who fell in love with a quiet man, but I really like imagining the moment when Beth and Robert first met each other. I like to imagine that it was like a lightning strike and they were immediately intrigued with each other. But however it developed, a connection developed between the two.
Now, Rosalie and Bernard, as humanistic and as focused on culture as they were, they did have some sense of practicality, because as we all know, what is true today was just as true back then. Art doesn't pay the rent. And so they really encourage their kids also to learn a practical trade on the side. And this is how Benno actually learned to design and make leather bags. Bookish Robert, went to study bookbinding. And Ellie, this is how she started to study to become a beautician, still finding a way for her aesthetic sensibilities to also make her some money.
But while all this was happening, they also had this really international perspective, because Bernard was part of this big international movement, and it started with birth control. Now, this is a little bit strange from our 21st century perspective, but the people who were fighting for birth control in the 20th century and the late 19th century, it wasn't about sexual freedom. It was about poverty. See, these poor families were having 15 and 16 children. So a lot of the people who fought for birth control were really explicitly doing it as an anti-poverty measure. They wanted people to be able to choose how many children they were having. And Bernard was part of that kind of international movement, but he was also the first doctor in the Netherlands to just talk about it as like sexual health. Like sexual health is part of your health just as much as like your heart health or not getting sick. So it was really shocking. It was really groundbreaking. He was the first doctor at the Aletta Jacobs House, which gave information to people about birth control. They didn't provide abortions, but they gave information about abortions, about all these matters of sexual health. And they thought, okay, when we open this practice, in the first year, we'll probably have about 600 patients in that first year. They had 3,000 patients in the first year. They very quickly had to move from this little tiny room to this massive building because so many people needed the information that they were giving, and they were the only ones to give it. Bernard also really became a spokesperson. So he would do these radio addresses at 11 o'clock, so the kids were already asleep. At 11 o'clock, he would do radio addresses about sexual health and answering people's questions. And so many questions came in that Rosalie, his wife, took over all the correspondence. She also ran the books for his practice. And when he left the Aletta Jacobs House and started a stichting, a foundation for sexual health, she ran all the books for that. So they really were this kind of equal partnership, this really duo. He also wrote articles and columns and gave speeches. And one thing that's notable is in 1935, he gave a speech that described homosexuality as just, this is something that happens. Like, he used some words that we wouldn't use today. Some of the words he used are now considered offensive. But he had this really matter-of-fact tone. Just, some men are attracted to other men, and we need to stop making a big deal out of it. Probably 2.5% of men in the Netherlands are attracted to other men. This is a normal part of life, and we need to stop discriminating. 1935, this man said this. At this point, there's still 248 bis is still in the books. There's still this very rampant anti-gay law in the books. And he's just talking about this matter-of-factly. So he's part of these huge movements, but because he's part of these huge movements, he also is seeing what's happening in Germany, and then what's happening in Poland.
And in 1940, in May, the Nazis take over the Netherlands, occupy Amsterdam as well, and everything kind of changes overnight. They start introducing these policies meant to isolate the Jewish community, like we mentioned a little bit in Jenny's story. We've heard, I think everyone has heard at least of a few of them, like the identity cards with the J in it that identifies someone as Jewish, or the work camp specifically for Jewish men. They even tried to create a ghetto, kind of force a ghetto into Amsterdam. And in fact, some of the maps, so on your right side here, there's an artwork that includes, it's kind of a collage of many, many different maps from during World War II. And some of those were used to try and plan out this Jewish ghetto. They never really got it off the ground. But another policy, like we also mentioned, was that they started limiting Jewish businesses to Jewish clients. We have an example again here from across the road. The Hollandse Schouwburg was then the Jewish theater, which means that Jewish performers who previously were in the carré and filling the entire space were now only allowed to perform at this theater and only for Jewish performers. And it affected the Premselas as well. Ellie, who was trying to kind of make her way in the world as an artist now, right, with this bright shining hope to be an artist, her clientele was limited. But she still tried to ply her trade. We see newspaper clippings from the Jewish newspaper at the time where she's offering portraits, both painted and sculpted. But on the side, she's really making her money as a beautician. I can imagine that she was grateful for her parents' foresight to push her into getting a practical education as well.
She also had some other light, right?
That's true. In December of 1941, she met and married a Jewish journalist called Max Wessel. So she did find this moment of joy, even though things were dark and getting darker.
And they were a good influence because Beth and Robert got engaged just a few months later. And as the Nazis invaded, and as the invasion really started to take hold, Bernard faced a series of choices. The first was about that limitation for practicing. One of the first limitations was that Jewish doctors could only treat Jewish patients. And at first, Bernard tried to work around it. He said, well, I'm not really a doctor so much as a marriage counselor. And the Nazi occupiers said, you can be a doctor or you can be a marriage counselor, but you can't be both. And he chose to be classified as a doctor, even though that meant giving up some of his patients. In fact, 95% of his patients. In fact, one of the people he was treating when this went into effect was a woman who was heavily pregnant. And they actually decided to induce the labor so that Bernard would be able to help her give birth before the rule went into effect. And I don't know why Bernard chose to stay as a doctor, but I'd like to believe it's because he saw what he could do with it. He was one of a few doctors that used their role to smuggle Jewish children into hiding. He also had to choose whether he was going to be on the Barneveld list. And if you haven't heard of this before, the Nazis asked the leaders of the Jewish Council to, who are the exceptional people in your community? So they're not going to be sent to these work camps. And Bernard didn't believe in collaborating with the Nazis. He didn't believe in volunteering for any list. So he chose not to be on the Barneveld list, and he chose not to take those protections. And the family chose to go into hiding. And here's another place where luck has this huge role. Because they had the good fortune to find someone who would put their name and their hiding addresses in the city registry, which meant that they'd be able to feed themselves because they would get ration cards with their hiding addresses. And that person left the notes on his desk where the Nazis found it. Robert, Rosalie, and Bernard were all arrested.
So just like the rest of her family, just like Robert, Rosalie, Bernard, and Benno, Ellie also went into hiding. And she did so with her husband, Max, although for a while they had some trouble. They were kind of falling in and out of contact with each other because Max was caught and he was sent to one of those work camps up in Friesland. Now he was able to escape with some help from a local family, get down to Ellie, only to be caught again and sent to another work camp and escape again. Apparently the Nazis were not quite as efficient as they presented themselves as. He was able to escape and they got back together, Max and Ellie, and they were able to go into hiding in Zaandam. with the left-leaning Ployer family. And they had some luck here. We hear from someone who visited them during World War II that the room that they were staying in was large and full of light. And besides this, something that stood out to me in the description was also that they seemed happy. They were energetic and they danced. And I wonder if they did this not because they were ignoring the world outside, not because they were ignoring the darkness and the danger that was hanging over their head, but as a kind of form of resistance against it, in defiance of it, living all the more joyously, all the more happily, despite maybe not having that much time left. And in November of 1943, that danger did come crashing down, like an avalanche that was set off by this tiny little pebble, because elsewhere in Zaandam, there was this married couple, and they had a very rocky relationship. They would have arguments constantly, and after one particularly really bad argument, this woman was furious and she wanted to take revenge on her husband. And she knew just the way to do it. You see, her husband was a communist. And so she stepped to the Amsterdam Sicherheidsdienst, the SD, the Nazi police, and she told them not only about her husband, the communists, but every family in Zaandam that she thought might have communist sympathies, and this did include the Ployer family, who were social democrats. What followed was a wave of arrests, including of the Ployers. And as the SD was pulling up to the house, Max and Ellie saw them coming and they tried to escape, but Max was caught while Ellie managed to make her way over the garden wall and escape, only to realize that she had nothing on her other than the clothes on her back. She didn't have any money, her important documents, and of course it's November, she didn't have her winter clothes either. Ellie realized what she needed to do, and she was brave enough to do it. She returned to the house. And then she was caught as well. The Ployer family was interrogated and released, but Max and Ellie were sent to Kamp Westerbork, an internment camp. There they were scheduled for deportation to Auschwitz. But then a number of epidemics hit the camp, and people were all over were sick. The conditions were terrible, and the deportation train to Auschwitz was delayed for this reason. At this moment, Ellie, even in this darkest hour, put herself forward as a nurse to try and help the people around her. But the delay didn't last very long. In February, the decision was made that it didn't matter how sick people were, it didn't matter that they had fevers, that they couldn't stand or walk. The train to Auschwitz had to go through. And so they packed as many people from the camp as they could into these trains, these carriages that were actually meant for livestock. And what followed was one of the most horrific train deportations in World War II history. The conditions were horrible as all these patients and sick people were packed together in the train. And a historian later describes that even before the train had left the station, had left Kamp Westerbork, the first person had died. Max and Ellie were both on this train, and on the 11th of February, they were taken to the gas chambers and murdered.
Let's take a moment to remember Max and Ellie.
It's really painful to see the way in which, because of the conditions created by the Nazis, something that today is so small and so human as like a forgotten note on a desk, or in Ellie's case, a nasty breakup, could have such incredibly tragic and outsized outcomes for the people involved. Now, while this was happening, her younger brother Benno was still in hiding. He'd gone into hiding on the 1st of January 1942 after an attempt to escape the Netherlands. You see, he had this friend, this Polish Jewish friend, and this guy, as soon as the Nazis invaded, he says, we have to get out of here, because he knew what European Jews could expect under Nazi occupation. And Benno was willing to listen to his friend, he was willing to learn from the past, and so they tried to escape, and here too, chance and luck plays a role. They managed to make their way into Belgium. In Belgium, the house they were staying at in Antwerp was raided, but they managed to get away. And because he had this Polish friend with him, and they were in a Polish neighborhood, this friend just started calling out in Polish, and the people knew what that meant. The Polish neighbors knew why they were calling out, and they were hidden there. So they survived, and then they made their way to the border, and again, luck, because they're making their way to the border itself. Benno describes this in the interview that they can almost see the border ahead of them. And Benno and his friends are walking in a group here, and ahead of them, separated from them, is another group that's also making its way across the border. And then, just as they're about to cross, this van pulls up, and SS soldiers come out, and they surround the entire group in front of them. But just by chance, because they're separated, and again by chance because they're so shocked, they don't move. Benno and his friends just stare, are frozen in place, which means that they just look like bystanders. If they'd run away, they would look guilty, but they just remained frozen in place. The group in front of them was arrested and taken away. At this point, they realized that the border crossing was too dangerous, and they returned to the Netherlands. So Benno goes into hiding, and he ends up in hiding at this family in Haarlem. And usually when we hear the stories of people who take people into hiding during World War II, we tend to hear of the heroes. We tend to hear of the people who are willing to do this out of a strong sense of moral obligation or a political conviction, just like we saw in Ellie's story with the family employer. But this wasn't always the case. For one, it was really common to ask for rent from the people that you took into hiding. And this, when I heard this, I was surprised. And I noticed also the interviewer reacted in shock to Benno, but Benno kind of dismisses it. He's very matter of fact about this. He says, of course, if you're taken into hiding, you pay for yourself. So in this sense, the family in Haarlem was not really an exception. The way that they were a little bit more exceptional was how many people they took into hiding. Because besides Benno, there were 9 other people, all cramped up in a tiny little space in the attic. And Benno gives a very simple reason for why this is. He says, this family had geldpest, money sickness. The more people they took into hiding, the more rent they were getting every month. And it wasn't good conditions either. Like I said, they were cramped, the food was bad, they weren't let into the house. Only Benno, the family liked Benno so much that only he was allowed into the kitchen. But also when the family had guests over, they had to remain completely still, frozen in place, because any cough or sniffle or creak of the floorboards could give away the fact that there were people in hiding. So they had to remain frozen in place. In the winter, this meant almost literally, right? It was cold up there. In the summer, the air is hot and stifling. And they couldn't go to the bathroom either. Their bladders would have to strain for hours. It was nothing short of torture. Not that the family particularly seemed to care much. Benno describes how they even forgot sometimes to tell the people in hiding that the guests had left. So they had to remain frozen in place for much longer than was really necessary. During this time, Benno was able to pay for himself because he learned that practical trade. He designed and made leather bags, and he sold them for enough money to pay for himself. So the conditions weren't great, but he did have a place to hide. So he stayed for almost 1.5 years until October 1943, and then something weird happened. He had this sudden, overwhelming feeling of danger. He suddenly felt it in his gut that he had to get out of there as soon as possible. And he says it's so weird because he's not a particularly intuitive person. He never used to have these kinds of feelings before. He never really had them since. But that's why he knew he had to listen to it. And so he reaches out to a family friend. Maybe, is there any chance there's another place I might be able to go into hiding? And as luck would have it, there was. And he could leave and go stay with a family friend in Amsterdam. And 2 weeks later, the husband of that family in Haarlem was arrested for smuggling tobacco into the Netherlands. Benno says, there's that money sickness again, geld pest. They didn't have enough from the rent, so they wanted to pad their wallets a little bit more, and they started smuggling tobacco, thereby not only putting himself in danger, but his family and the people in hiding as well. This man spent the rest of the war in a camp, and when his house was raided, the people hiding upstairs disappeared and were never heard from again. Now when this happened, Benno left the house for a little while, just in case the man would tell about other people that he knew about in hiding. Luckily, this man didn't do this. And so Benno spent the rest of the war relatively well off. He became really good friends with the woman he was staying with in hiding. He was able to make enough money from the purses that he was selling. And he was lucky. When he went out, he had, of course, a fake ID card, but men of his age, because he's only in his 20s at this point, men of his age were being just taken to work camps in Germany, which he managed to avoid. And he was also lucky in the sense that he was recognized once or twice. He found out about this after the war. Once or twice he was recognized. But the people who did recognize him had the wit not to come up to him and to pretend not to know him. And because chance is the big theme here, it's fitting that it's on Benno's 25th birthday, on the date of his birthday, that the Netherlands is liberated. He has double reason to celebrate, of course, but at the same time, he quickly discovers that he's the only one of his family left in town. He doesn't know what's happened to Robert. He doesn't know what happened to Rosalie, or Bernard, or Ellie, or Max. The only person he knows that's still in town is Robert's fiancée, Beth.
And so Benno and Beth settle in for this long wait. One of the things that Max would later write about is that there was no communication and there was no plan for getting the survivors of concentration camps back to Amsterdam. So Beth would just go to Central Station every day. And I can see this so clearly, her standing as people come off the trains, desperately looking for Robert's face. She would go up to anyone that she knew. And remember, we're talking about concentration camp survivors. So she would see these faces that she knew, but they were transformed and gaunt. And she would say, I'm Benno Premsela's daughter-in-law. Do you know what happened to them? Do you know what happened to his son? And after days and days and days of the same experience, she ran into someone who told her. Bernard and Rosalie were sent to Auschwitz, where they were killed upon arrival.
Let's take a moment to remember Bernard and Rosalie as well.
In July, the Danish Red Cross brought Robert back. And again, he had had another measure of luck. Someone had told him, if you get put on one of those trains, tell them you're a metal worker. And so he too was sent to Auschwitz, but the second he got off the train, he told them, I'm a metal worker, I can work with metal. And so he was sent to Leipzig, where he was in one of those work camps that Gus just mentioned. He had a heated barrack. It was still rough conditions, but he was able to survive. A couple months later, he and Bev finally got married. They worked together to open a bookstore that sold books about art. That bookstore is still open today, and I'm so happy to say that their descendants are actually here with us today as well.
So the joy of his brother's return notwithstanding, Benno had lost almost everything. He'd experienced dark side of humanity in his personal experiences during the war, and I can only imagine what it must have felt like as he tries to grapple not only with his own personal mourning, but also as the full magnitude of the Nazi genocide became clear, realizing that they're just one of so many. Directly after the war, he got a job as a truck driver, returning artworks that were hidden in art bunkers and in caves around the Netherlands. And he describes this moment in the interview that really stuck out to me. He'd gone down to Limburg by the St. Petersberg, Mount St. Peter, where there's one of these art bunkers. And he just spent the whole morning carrying artworks back and forth to the trucks. And it was time for lunch, and he sits down, and the sun is shining, and above him, and he mentions this, the linden trees are blossoming. And around him, there's more food than he's seen in years. And this is a moment, I think, when he must have asked himself, how do I go on? There's a kind of a peace returning, a kind of a normality, and at the same time, everything is broken. And I think there's really only one answer to the question. How do I go on? I go on. In his professional life, Benno would turn away from the ugliness of World War II and seek out beauty. He became an interior designer. And he started out small. He started working at the Bijenkorf, which at the time had been run completely into the ground by the Nazis during the war. And he started working in the furniture section where they were getting new designs from Sweden and Denmark, and he would create these beautiful interiors. And I don't think we should underestimate the importance of beauty in this moment. Because now, we look around, we have a beautiful city. Europe is filled with beautiful design, but at the time Europe was war-torn and bombed out, and there were bullet holes everywhere, and in every street there was a neighbor, there was a house where your old Jewish neighbors had lived that was now empty. In this moment, beauty represents hope and a movement forward. And we actually see this in the way that people responded to Benno's work, because later he became the window display designer of the Bijenkorf. They used to just whenever they had new products, they would just plonk them down in the window, and he developed it into an art form, designing these window displays, etalages. And we have newspaper clippings in which they talk about how people would travel in from outside of town to see the reveal of the new Premsela window display. And I wonder, I think also that in some way Benno by doing this was honoring the legacy of his sister. His sister, the sculptor, the beautician, who he had followed into art school to become an interior designer. And I think also that him turning away from ugliness and towards beauty, maybe that was the same kind of rebelliousness that his sister Ellie had shown when she was in hiding, right? That he's not ignoring the ugliness and the darkness, but he's defying it. by trying to make the world beautiful. And I think that we see evidence of this in another aspect of Benno's life as well. The reason that moment in Limburg under the blossoming linden trees stood out to me is because I think that's the moment when he made a decision that would steer him for the rest of his life. He said, "I never want to hide again." And this is particularly meaningful in Benno's context, because not only was he Jewish, but he was gay. And it's in his queer activism that he really made history. You can imagine what it must have been like for him knowing this about himself, and then looking around him after World War II as gay men and women were being returned from the Nazi prison camps and being sent straight to prison because homosexuality was still illegal in the countries they were being returned to. In West Germany this happened. In the Netherlands, gay men and women were too afraid to get the compensation that they were owed, that they were entitled to, like other victims of the Nazis, because there was too much of a risk involved in outing yourself as gay. And on a personal level, Ben also talks about in the interview how coming out back then was reinventing the wheel every time because they were isolated from one another. There was no way for you to reach out to someone that you knew that had had a similar experience and learn from them. And Benno had seen the dangers of isolation firsthand during World War II, and he'd seen the importance of community, of solidarity, and of collectivity as well. And so he set to work trying to build queer collective power. In 1947, he joined an organization which at the time was called the Shakespeare Club. This was a pseudonym for a gay rights organization. It later became known as the Cultuur- en Ontspanningscentrum, or COC. In English, that means the Culture and Relaxation Center. Again, another pseudonym, but it was a gay rights organization. And at the time, it was common that when you joined using a pseudonym, again, because the risk of being outed as homosexual was too great. But Benno had decided never to hide again, and he joined with his real name. Later, he became the first homosexual man to go on national television and talk about his life as a gay man, thereby not only forcing Dutch audiences to reckon with the fact that someone that they knew and admired as an interior designer, someone they looked up to, was a gay man. And also, he was a role model for people who did feel like they had to hide. In 1962, he became chairman of the COC, and then his dedication to building queer collective power was really challenged because a rift was opening up in the queer community between the older generation, who tended to favor more conciliatory political strategies. They tried to do a little bit more older politics, isn't that the phrase? They tried to be a little bit more easygoing, tried to fit in a little bit more and build rights that way, versus the younger generation who would have none of that. They were sick of oppression. They were sick of these homophobic laws from the 1920s that were still on the books, and they were not afraid to throw some bricks through some windows. And in the 10 years that Benno was chairman of the COC, this rift threatened to develop into a full-blown split, but he somehow managed to navigate the differing needs and demands of the different groups and keep them together, and get rid of those homophobic laws in the process. And he didn't stay at just queer liberation. Because in the 60s and 70s, as anti-colonial and feminist movements began to rise, he lent his support to them as well. Because he understood that all oppression is tied together. He actually says it himself: any type of discrimination can lead to the gas chambers. And for all of this, there's this moment in the interview when he seems to get a little bit annoyed because he says, yeah, people always say that I'm brave for doing this, that I'm brave for being out, that I'm brave for fighting, but I'm not brave. For him, it was a matter of fact. That's just what you do. When he was sitting there under those blossoming linden trees in 1945, I don't think he realized what an important person that he would become in the future. But he somehow turned the unimaginable suffering of the Holocaust into a source of strength, of political convictions, and of a willingness to fight for what's right. I think we should look to Benno and take hope. And that's not only because Benno is an inspiring person, because I admire him personally, but because when it comes to cruelty and injustice and oppression, hopelessness means giving in, and hope becomes an act of resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming. We've been thinking about these stories so much, and it really means a lot to us to be able to tell you what we've discovered about these incredible people. We'll hang out in the back if you want to come chat with us. We have so many more stories to tell, but we'll come chat. If you want to chat with us, please come chat with us in the back. And otherwise, thank you so much for being here.